Welcome, and thank you for clicking on this video. Welcome to episode number 6 in a series where we are checking out a variety of different short-scale bass strings. In this episode, we're going to be checking out the Pressurewounds from GHS. How will these compare, both in sound and feel, to the GHS Boomers we had in episode number 5? Let's find out. The Pressurewound set is GHS's version of the half round. So think of a typical roundwound string over a hex core, but then you flatten the outer windings to get a smoother surface. These are supposed to kind of be a hybrid between a flat wound string and a full round wound string. So something in between. Now, will it actually give you the sonic properties of a flat wound and a round wound? How will it feel? We're going to find out today. And in this comparison, we're going to put these up to the GHS Boomers set that I had featured in episode number 5. Just like all the other episodes, I have taken great care in ensuring that the string to pickup height is consistent across all sets of strings. As well, the signal chain is identical in this comparison. What's different in this episode, however, is these Pressurewound strings have been on this test bass, so the Fender Player 2 Series PJ Mustang. These strings have been on for about 7 days now. And the reason for that is, having spoken to a few different bass players and having looked online, I kind of came to the conclusion that most people felt it took at least a week for these to break in before sounding more like what we think GHS intended these Pressurewounds to sound like. So in this comparison, we're going to compare 7-day-old Pressurewounds up against the GHS Boomers from episode number 5. And as a result of kind of the logistics of having had these strings on for 7 days, we're going to reuse some of the footage from episode 5 in this comparison. Just like previous episodes, we're going to have several passes in this comparison track. In the first half, we're going to be running the P pickup by itself with the tone knob first at 100 and then at 50%. And in the latter half, we're going to be running both the P and the J pickup together, again with the tone knob at 100 and then at 50. I hope you enjoyed that sonic comparison. Please let me know what you thought of the tones by leaving a comment below. Okay, let's first start talking about the packaging. So, unlike the GHS Boomers, these Pressurewounds did not come in a sealed package. Instead, this was a more typical kind of plastic sleeve. Each string came individually wrapped in their own envelope, but this was not sealed or put in an airtight package, unlike the Boomers. So there's the first difference. The string wound length on these Pressurewounds were advertised to be 32.75 inches on the outer packaging. However, if you look at the inside envelopes for each string, those are stamped as having a string wound length of 32.5 inches. Now, I'm being perhaps a little more critical than I need to be with GHS here, but maybe these were printed at different times. In practice, however, the actual string wound length of this particular set of Pressurewounds was much closer to 32.5 inches than it was to 32.75. Let's now talk about the feel and the playability of these GHS Pressurewounds. I quite like how these feel. In terms of gauges, these are 96 to 40, but they feel more balanced, if you will. I know that's a bit of a loaded term, but compared to the Boomers, these feel more kind of cohesive as a set than the Boomer set I tried in episode number 5. The texture and the feel of the string is considerably smoother than the Boomers. Now, the Boomers themselves were already pretty smooth, but these are even smoother. And in terms of string noise, it's going to be harder to tell through the microphone here. But the string noise is a lower pitch, so it's a lower note than the Boomers. So I won't really say the string noise is significantly lower in volume compared to the Boomers, but is a lower pitched note, so it seems to be kind of less pronounced. Now, these strings are both supple, yet still have a nice kind of playable tautness to it. So it doesn't feel flabby, but at the same time, it doesn't feel like super tight and wiry or cabley like a flat wound would. So I think from a feel and playability point of view, I quite like these, and they're very comfortable to play, and it doesn't take a lot of finger pressure to depress a string or fret the string. I like the way these feel. Now let's talk about the sound. As I understand it, the point of a pressure wound or a half wound or a ground wound, depending on the company, they use slightly different terms. But the concept is similar across the different companies. You take a round wound string and you flatten the outer winding to get a smoother playing surface. Now, does it sound like a flat wound? Here I will say no. I don't think it sounds like a flat wound. The more kind of typical flat wound bass string has slightly rolled off lows, a tame high end. It has a characteristic thump attack and then a very quick decay of the note. A traditional flat wound, at least. Some of the more kind of contemporary flat wounds are slightly different. But what most of us kind of attribute to a flat wound bass string is that initial thumpy attack and then a quicker decay. These Pressurewounds have a nice attack to them, but they don't have the short decay or the quick decay that a typical flat wound would. Now let's talk about the other end, the high end, the high frequencies. Do these sound like a flat wound? Does it have that kind of muted, rolled off high end like a typical flat wound would? Again, no, I don't think so. The high end actually is still quite present. It's not clicky and clanky like a typical round wound set would be, but it doesn't have the muted highs that a flat wound set does either. Let's talk about the mid-range. Now, compared to the Boomers, I felt the Pressurewounds had a much more subdued and less abrasive, less aggressive mid-range compared to the Boomer set. I quite like how the mid-range comes out of these strings. But does it sound like a flat wound? Again, I don't think so. Now, just because it doesn't sound like a flat wound doesn't mean I don't like it. In fact, I quite like these strings, but I like them as a kind of a variation of a round wound string than I do as an alternative to a flat wound string, if you know what I'm trying to get at. So I do think they're closer to a round wound string than they are to a flat. Another really cool thing I want to point out is on short scale bases, sometimes flat wound strings can give you a very kind of mushy, muddy, and phasey sounding, especially with the upper frets. However, with these Pressurewounds, that is not the case. And I actually think that is one of the good selling features of these strings, is if you were to listen, here, or use the P pickup and we have the tone knob at 100%, listen to the high fretted notes here. So first of all, there's way more sustain than you would get from a traditional flat wound string. But more importantly, there's the fundamental of the note is there, but it's not kind of murky and cloudy like a lot of flat wounds would sound up here. So overall, I quite like these strings, but I think it has a very kind of specific target audience. What I would say is if you're looking for kind of a more traditional flat wound string tone, I don't think these are going to give you that. What I think these strings do, however, is it takes a round wound string that takes a bit of the zing off, but it gives you a more subdued, mellow mid-range where it's not quite as aggressive, but gives you kind of a lower pitched string noise. That's where I think these strings shine, is a more subdued round wound type sound than it is at the flat wound sound. So if that's the kind of tone you're looking for, if you're looking for a little bit more bite, but not clicky and clanky like a round wound, but still retaining sustain and note definition, check out these Pressurewounds. I quite like them. All right. Thanks so much for watching this episode. Catch you next time. Peace.